Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslims for Progressive Values. I am your host, Kendra Cordova, and today we have another really great video. This is going to be the second class in our live Zoom classes that we have for the Progressive Islam curriculum through MPV. So today's only going to cover the first half of Unit 2. Last month, the class ran about 2 hours long. And so to shorten it to a 1 hour class, we're going to be doing half of the unit today and then the other half of the unit next month. Shout out to the ANA Foundation for making this possible and creating this course with MPV. And of course, if you are looking for more information on MPV, or you are looking for a great place to donate your zakat money to a progressive Islamic force in the world, then make sure you go to mpvusa.org. So, welcome everybody. So today's class is going to be over Unit 2, which is specifically called Foundations and Principles of Progressive Islam. What we're going to cover is really just going to be, what is progressive Islam? How did this term come up? Is this really a new idea or is this an older idea? And then what sorts of scholars we might run into and what are their teachings on this sort of path within Islam, right? This theology. We're going to talk a little bit about liberation theology in the next class. Up to here, we're going to be doing like the introduction of progressive Islam, sort of the foundations and historical context. And then we're going to go over the beginning concept of ijtihad. We won't do the full section on that because that one's kind of long too, but we're going to like touch on it a little bit. We'll finish the rest next month, inshallah. So here we go. So lesson number 1, the section here is Introduction to Progressive Islam. So progressive Islam itself is actually a new term, but the idea isn't new. Progressive Islam is sort of the foundations of Islam from the beginning, really. Progressive Muslims believe that Islam, since its founding, has been a progressive faith. And while we might not think that, some of the things that were done in early Islam would be considered progressive today, when we look at the heart and soul of Islam for its time, the things that it was starting to do were already extremely progressive for its time. When we look at things like the idea of getting good favors and merits for freeing slaves, for women having their own rights that are defined, both women and slaves having rights that they didn't have previously. For the time, that was considered a big deal to bring that up at all, or to enforce those sorts of things. So it's been progressive since its time, but how can we fit a religion from 1400 years ago into the modern world? This is what we're going to start learning about today. So the idea is that Islam, since its founding, has believed that every human has the same intrinsic worth, and that the true measure of how moral a person is, particularly as a Muslim, has little to do with the ritual practice and everything to do with how they serve their fellow humans. We learn about this throughout all of our experience with Islam, right? Through the Quran, the Hadith, that when it is the day of judgment, it is just us and Allah. It's just us and God, right? We're not going to have a bunch of people to vouch for us or whatever that is. It's about you and your deeds. And the hadith that says, Allah doesn't look to your face or your clothes, Allah looks to your heart. So here, the main principles of Islam say that the whole goal is that everybody has a chance to connect with God, build that relationship with God, do good deeds, earn good deeds, and be worthy of heaven with God, right? So like we can have all of these, regardless of your class, regardless of your gender, everybody has that. So we're going to look at 2 main definitions here. These are going to be from 2 of the more like current renowned scholars of progressive Islam. We have Omid Safi, who, if you guys have looked at the book, I think I brought this one up before, Progressive Muslims. This is a collection of essays and chapters from different progressive scholars and activists of progressive Islam throughout the world. So he edited that, put that one together. And then we're also going to have Adis Dudarija, So first of all, from Omid Safi here, we have one of his quotes is that vision and activism are both necessary. Activism without vision is doomed from the start. Vision without activism quickly becomes irrelevant. Okay, so we can have all of these wonderful ideas of the world and how it should be, but if we don't take action on it, right, then it becomes irrelevant, as he says here. Whereas if you have activism, but you don't have a vision of what it's going to look like, what is your actual goal, right? Hard to tell if you've achieved it or not. And that can also lead to issues. So here in this curriculum, one of the goals is to sort of merge those two things, understanding the visions and how we can act on them in the world. So Omid Safi, he's an Iranian scholar of Islam. He teaches at Duke University in North Carolina. He also used to teach at Colgate University in New York. And then he focuses on Sufism, contemporary Islamic thought, Islamic history, progressive Islam, philosophy. And according to him, this is his definition of progressive Islam. He says that progressive Islam encompasses a number of themes, striving to realize a just and pluralistic society through a critical engagement with Islam, a relentless pursuit of social justice, an emphasis on gender equality as a foundation of human rights, and a vision of religious and ethnic pluralism. There's a lot of big words in that one, but basically what he's saying is that the whole point is, again, that everybody has this intrinsic value, that regardless of your race or your class or who you were before became a Muslim, or even if you're not a Muslim, if you're just a human living here, you know, that you have rights and that we need to make sure that everybody is treated like the creation of God because God made everyone, right? And so there has to be that equality of treatment regardless of who, what, when, where, why, right? All right, so in addition to these four key themes, he also says that the worth of a human being is measured by a person's character, not the oil under their soil and not their flag. So we don't get to pick where we were born in the world, right? You were born on this one particular piece of land. That doesn't necessarily define your worth, right? We need to look at people as who they are as people, their heart, their mind, their soul, their actions in the world. I made a note here because when I was taking this one class, which is going over like the psychology of like the way we see each other in the world, there's this idea of what's called like a vertical, and then there's like a horizontal way of looking at people. So a vertical is like a hierarchy. And what that means is when you get into theologies like a lot of conservative Islam or like you guys know, I was raised in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is big on this one. Anytime if you have any kind of idea that if you look at a certain type of person and they could either be seen as better than you or lesser than you have this hierarchical mentality of the world and the way that we see other people. And this becomes very dangerous. This is one way is because it can make us feel like we're not worthy, we're not good enough to do these things or to make a difference in the world, or that we shouldn't stand up to certain people because we are beneath them or whatever that is. And it can also lead to us putting others down. If you can look at somebody and think that that you're better than them, which I've talked about in lots of other videos about how that is literally the mindset of the shaitan, right? When we talk about that, looking at someone and saying, I'm better than you, right? That leads to, this injustice that can lead to violence. It can lead to all these awful things. Because you have this hierarchical position. And especially when we look at religion and we say, we can't possibly know what Allah's judgment or opinion of a certain person is. Like, we don't know that. We are just humans. So the idea that we would put people into some hierarchy and have some definitive idea that that's how it is it just doesn't make a lot of sense. A horizontal vision of the world, right, is that everybody is sort of put on this like equal plane. And then the only like shift here is just shifts in like differences, like a spectrum, right? Because every part of identity and experience can be seen as some sort of spectrum, whether it's, how much money or how much time someone has, how long did somebody live, or, gender identity, whatever that is. Like most of these things can be seen shifted on a spectrum, but none of them are going to be seen as better or worse. They're just going to be seen as different. And that's okay. And that's what this horizontal spectrum of seeing people is. So that is part of this idea of progressive Islam, right? So according to Safi, progressive, like the concept of progressive, before the identification of Muslim simply implies that the individual strives towards a, quote, universal notion of justice in which no single community's prosperity, righteousness, or dignity comes at the expense of another. So we cannot, use other people, put other people down in order to make ourselves better than, or make our egos feel better because, now they're beneath us, whatever that is. If you believe that all people have an inherent dignity in the world and that we need to treat everybody with the same level of justice, of kindness, of freedoms and all of that, that is the definition of being progressive, right? So he also points out that in progressive Islam, interpreting Islamic texts, particularly the Quran for the 21st century, and the problems and solutions that these contemporary times ask Muslims to confront, right? I've also talked about this in other videos. If you have seen any of my work, you know that when we look at the Quran, it's so important, I've said, not to take the entire universe and try to fit it into the Quran, because the Quran is just one book. It's just one collection of the knowledge of Allah. And as Allah says in there, right, if the oceans were ink for writing the words of my Lord, surely it would run out if it had been filled twice over before the words of my Lord were through, meaning Allah has so much infinite, amazing knowledge of the whole universe, right? That of course you're not going to fit it into like a little text, right? This is just a tiny little drop of that ink. And so there are going to be things in the modern world that aren't talked about in the Quran. And that doesn't mean that those things are un-Islamic. It just means that those things aren't in the Quran, right? So the Quran isn't going to give us information on driving, right? Using cell phones, that kind of stuff, right? It will talk about the way we should treat each other, and you can take that into those contexts. But having to take modern issues, modern conflicts, modern situations, and connecting them back to the Quran is important as progressive Muslims, because we don't think that the Quran was just for that time, right? That it, as we say, is for all people of all times, but that it is also this sliver, and we need to make sure that we are open to more knowledge of the world than might just be shown in the Quran itself. Another interesting thing about progressive Islam, and I don't think I've actually talked to a lot of Muslims about this. There's this belief that progressive Islam is Western, right? That the idea that like progressive Islam was created by the West. And when you go and you look at the scholars of progressive Islam, not only from our time, but from other times, which we're going to look at today, they actually like condemn the idea that the West has any kind of like superiority, or that, the West is, that like savior mentality that, the West needs to go like save the whole world and stuff. Or that we should always be just like them, because one of the concepts we're going to talk about today is going to be talking about how we can critique multiple sides of something. It's not like we're on this side and they're on this other side. We could openly say as progressive Muslims that both sides might have issues, right? And we need to take it as a whole, not just one side or the other. So it also says here that it's important that we have the ability to condemn Western modernity and hegemony associated with the West's export of its moral superiority complex. This is what separates progressive Islam from Islam's modernity movement. So the modernity movement is saying like we need to modernize Islam, and a lot of times this will have a lot of Western influence in it. Whereas progressive Islam, the whole point is having these core values and then going forward with those, approaching the Quran with core values of social justice, of everybody having this inherent worth, right? Not necessarily that we all need to like be Western, if that makes sense. So it's important to moving on here, we're going to take a look at how progressive Muslims fit in between traditionalists and modernists to see where that is. The second definition that we have here, so that was Omid Safi. So Adis Dudajira is an sorry, I almost said Austrian because of the Bosnian, Australian Bosnian scholar of Islam based out of Griffin University in Australia. So here they say that, quote, who's a progressive Muslim, someone who seriously and critically engages with the full spectrum of the Islamic tradition and considers Islam not just as a matter of individual or private belief, but as having profound relevance in the political arena, but only in accordance with the above principles, like cosmopolitan, democratic, committed to human rights and gender equality, invested in a vibrant society, etc. So, according to them, their four main points are: one, a critical position against the hegemonic. I cannot speak today. I'm so sorry, guys. I've been up for like 16, 18 hours now. So hegemonic economic, political, social, and cultural forces of the global north. Two, a critical position against patriarchal exclusivity. Three, critical positions against the values underpinning both Enlightenment and modernity. And four, the ability to challenge neo-traditional Islamic discourse and Western-centric concepts. So we're going to get into a little bit of that. But the big thing here, the big takeaway from this section is that oh, thank you. Yeah, I will trip over my words. I'll probably mispronounce some things tonight, but I am very excited about this topic. Thank you, guys. So the important thing going forward with all of these concepts is just understanding that at the end of the day, all it means to be a progressive Muslim is that I believe when I walk in to talk to somebody or meet somebody or whatever that is, I believe that that human is worthy of respect, right? Has an inherent dignity, has rights, has freedoms. And I don't care if the person walking up to me is a Muslim or not. I don't care if the person walking up to me is white or brown or black or anything else, right? I don't care about their skin color. I don't care about, is this a male or a female? Is this gender non-binary? Are they trans? Whoever they are, right? Whether they're an adult or a child, whether they're elderly, whether they have a disability, like that doesn't matter. When I go and I meet someone and I am working with someone, whenever we see anyone, we say that this person is a person, right? And therefore is divinely created by Allah and deserves respect, even if I don't agree with them. I want to throw that one even there. Even if I don't agree with them. This next section goes on to say, progressive Muslims need to act justly and fight for equality, quote, even if it is against their own self-interests. Even if it is against their own self-interests. That is the hard part for most people, not just Muslims, people around the world. That is the most difficult part of being progressive that a lot of people can't get their minds around. This is saying that, like, if for some reason, let's say I, as a Muslim, believe that, you know, modest dress is the way to go. Modest dress is how people should be. We need to cover our bodies, not be like too showy. That's what I believe, right? I then also have to say that my right to choose the clothes that I wear, like if I want to wear hijab, if I want to wear just generally like modest clothing, if I want to wear a niqab, if whatever it is that I want to wear means that the next person also has the same right to wear what they want to wear, not to dress the way that I think is ethical, but that my freedom to make the choice of how I think I should dress should go to the next person. So that even if you believe that modest dress is the way to go, you need to make sure that you are not infringing on other people's rights to do that. And that, especially if you're living in a society where most people are like you, can be one of the hardest things to get your mind around. Now, luckily, I have moved over 12 times in my life, and I've been to like over a dozen countries. So I am well aware that there are people that are very different from myself, right? But oftentimes when I talk to someone who doesn't understand this concept, it's because everybody around them is like them, right? And so they're just like, well, that's the way I do it is the way that everybody should do it, right? Because that's the majority. But reminding people that, for example, me as a Muslim, as a revert Muslim, people have said, oh my gosh, mashallah, that is so amazing. It's beautiful. It's the only reason I was allowed and able to do that safely and have the freedom to learn about Islam and connect with the faith was because I lived in an area that allowed for freedom of religion and freedom of expression and freedom of education. I wasn't raised Muslim. And in fact, I was raised to think that Islam was this like awful thing, right? And if I wouldn't have had access to education, if I wouldn't have had the ability to convert safely, right, that might not have been a thing. And now, if I appreciate the fact that I had been able to do that, I now, as a progressive Muslim, or just a progressive in general, need to understand that that freedom that I was given that changed my life and that meant so much to me needs to be afforded to everyone. And that includes people that might leave Islam. A lot of people think like, oh, well, if Islam's the right way, everybody's got to do it. Like, no. If I inherently believe everybody has freedom, everybody has rights, everybody has all of these things, that means that I want to make sure that everybody has the ability to do that, even if, as it says here, that goes against what I would consider to be my own self-interests. Now, again, I'm not saying that I believe that everybody, needs to be a Muslim to be a good person. I'm just using this as like a hypothetical for you guys that this part is what a lot of people have trouble with. So this goes into what we're going to talk about later. I did do a whole video on it. If you guys go back to some of my videos, I did one on liberation theology. But this is where that concept of liberation theology sits, is like when you read the Quran and you understand what it is to be a Muslim, you're like, wow, this is about, making sure everybody's treated the right way, everybody gets these freedoms. That falls under liberation theology. So a few other scholars and writers and progressives that we hear about are people like Amina Wadud, Kessia Ali, Asma Barlas, Khalid Abu al-Fadl, and Ziba Mir Husseini. I have a few of their pieces. I have a Ziba Mir Husseini book back here about gender equality in Islam. And then Mustafa Akil, I think he's brought up later in this section actually, is a great one as well. You guys have probably seen some of his works. Reopening Muslim Minds, Islam Without Extremes, and Why as a Muslim I Defend Liberty. You can still see my bookmark. I'm always going through this one to find little fun quotes and things. Those are all great as well. So I would definitely look into some of those names if you haven't, or read some of those texts, because they're really inspiring. It's great to hear about all these different progressive Muslims who have been raised in different parts of the world, different societies, different families, and the way that they all came to the same like beautiful truth within the Quran with this liberation theology. So let's see what else we got. What other notes do I have? With everything in life, especially religious beliefs, progressive Islamic beliefs exist on a scale, and all individuals who identify as a progressive Muslim have an independent set of beliefs that suit their relationship with God and their understanding of the Word of God. Individual freedom of thought, individual right to get to know God and connect with God the way that it works for you, your experience, your mind, your heart, through the Quran and everything else, right? Which is great because progressive Muslims, authors, speakers, scholars are all going to have all these different perspectives on things like hijab, on things like gender equality and just everything. And it's really great to hear all of them. And at the end of the day, one of the great things about being a part of a progressive Islamic community is that they're not telling you these things to tell you that you need to be like them. That's really powerful because I know there are times like if I go to a masjid or I've had some people, email me, send me some messages where they get nervous being around other Muslims because they've been like ridiculed or like have this like constant correction on them about every little thing without any like open dialogue. There's no like questions like, hey, like what is your experience with Islam? Like what is important to you? When do you feel most connected to Allah? Like those conversations don't happen. It's very much just like, oh, you're wearing the wrong clothes. And it starts to become very correcty. And with progressive Muslims, I have found that it's beautiful to get to share experiences without that external like pressure, societal pressure there, and instead sort of a celebration of all of our experiences as Muslims. I love that. So we're going to be talking about Tawhid today. So Tawhid is the idea that Allah is one. This unity of Allah, right? The idea that all creation comes from Allah, one. This is really powerful because even with all of our diversity, which is the way that Allah made everybody and nature and everything else, that we're all part of the same like creation. It's very unifying that every time someone prays, it's all going to the same place, right? That Allah made every single person that you see. And this is really important. Another reason this is important though, and this is something we're going to talk about, is that because we worship Allah, when we see Allah as this unifying one thing, as we know, anything that you would then connect with being just as powerful or whatever with Allah, that's called shirk. And unfortunately, we end up with some cultural aspects that start to do that, right? Whether that's worship of money or worship of like certain people, that can really bog down the true purity of having this direction, like direct connection to Allah and no one else. So here we have to worship or attribute any divine aspects to a human for any reason, whether it be because of their authority or their gender, is considered shirk, right? An unpardonable sin for progressive Muslims. This understanding of Tawhid demands gender equality in all societal systems and the removal of hierarchical systems, particularly when it comes to accessing Islamic scholarship and interpretation of the divine. Okay. We see a lot of places in the world, or we have personal experiences where gender will become one of the things that decides like if someone it gets to have this authority or if someone is better than, if we go back to this, like better than someone else, we shouldn't put anybody really on a pedestal, because if we start putting this energy into like, oh, this person, this entity, this, whatever is just so important and amazing, I will do anything for them. Like you've gone like way too far, right? We need to focus on God. We need to focus on us and God, our relationship to God. This is where you fall into this concept that I brought up earlier. We're going to get into it now, called multiple critique. Multiple critique is how you can be in the middle of like these two different sides and be able to say that there's problems on both sides. A lot of times people will like dig their heels into one specific view, one specific scholar that they follow, and only everything that scholar says, right? Or one specific cultural practice, because that's the way it is. That's the way everybody does it. This is just the way it is, right? One specific school of thought. I've been asked in comments and emails about like, well, oh, you seem like you fall under this very specific school of thought. Is that what you would call yourself? And I always let them know that I am hesitant to do that, because what happens when you do that is if you say, I follow this interpretation only, or I follow this scholar's teachings only, every human is flawed. Every human can mess up. And if you don't keep your mind open to learning new things or being adaptable so that as you learn new information, with this critical reasoning and research and all of that, and you can't change because you're stuck in this one mindset, that doesn't allow for this growth and freeing from these like shackles of sorts, right, that we put on ourselves socially, mentally, emotionally. We need to always be learning, always be trying to learn as much as we can and be open to learning new things and admitting that maybe the way I was doing it before wasn't super great. I've learned new information and I can now shift and try to do better. I think it was Maya Angelou, wasn't it, that says like, don't be upset about the things you did previously because you didn't know better, but once you know better, do better. I love that quote. So multiple critique here definitions: a scholarly approach used to engage with and criticize individuals, institutions, and systems that limit and oppress people. Criticism of all forms and oppression, both inside and outside of that individual's community. An example of this is going to be that we can hold these two things true, that there are Islamic institutions or sort of like cultural foundations here that have been built and enforced that creates this gender oppression we were talking about. Not because Islam is oppressive, but because the human interpretation that was then followed and enforced was oppressive. We can admit that that is true in some cases, while also admitting that the West's belief that Islam is oppressive is also incorrect, because we don't believe that Islam is oppressive. We believe that humans oppress humans, and that this is a problem of interpretation and enforcement. So you can hold that the West doesn't have it right and that it's a lot of Islamic societies don't have it right either. And you can look at the flaws and the truths within both sides without having to just be like, I'm going to pick one side, right? And it's called multiple critique. It's very, very important as we learn. When engaging in multiple critique, progressive Muslims base their assertions on interpretations of the Quran and Hadith from a standpoint of social justice. Social justice. There's that saying that if you don't believe in anything, you'll fall for anything. You might have heard that, like stand for something or you'll fall for anything. I used to think that that meant sort of this idea that you have to pick a side and then you just like hold true to that side forever. And that is not what it meant. Because when you see people that do that, they can be manipulated by that side or that person, right? Because then they don't have to think critically. They can just agree to whatever that is. And in that way, you're falling for something, right? You have to know what is important to you, what you stand for, not what you stand against, not what you hate, right? Because the list of all the things you hate doesn't actually say anything about what you believe in, what you hold dear, what you find to be important or true. So understanding that as we approach anything, we have to hold on to these like core beliefs. What is important to you? And then go from there. And that's what happens here. Coming to the Quran and Hadith with a standpoint of social justice. Social justice serves as the baseline of these interpretations because according to progressive Muslims, Islam is inherently a progressive religion oriented around social justice and the universality of rights to which all humans are endowed. For progressive Muslims, Islam is not a religion that can be segmented into progressive and traditional. Rather, Islam is an inherently progressive religion when accurately interpreted and in accordance with the principles of the early Ummah. So again, when we look back at like the foundations of Islam, which I talked about in our class last month, we're saying that like from the start, it was already very progressive. The whole idea was to be progressive. And if we come to that mentality and that understanding that Islam is meant for social justice, it was meant to stop people from sexual and gender abuse, right? To stop people from killing people because you just don't like them or don't agree with them. To stop the mistreatment of other fellow human beings, saying that, like, you know, at this time of slavery, like, you now have to start like clothing them with your own clothing, feeding them with the food that you eat. They are people, and you need to treat them as you would treat yourself, as you would treat the people that you care about. At the time, that was like a light bulb for people. That was like, oh my gosh, that's whoa, you know, no one's really been talking about that. And a lot of people didn't like it, right? Especially a lot of like the people who had this authority and power at the time, they did not like it. Because when you come in and you say, hey, you got to treat everybody the same, that takes away some of their power because they have that hierarchical mentality instead of this horizontal, we're all humans mentality, right? So also important that we don't measure our success in new theology or the identification of new theories, but rather actual change on the ground level in the world, right? It's also important that we continue the pursuit of justice, as it's found in the prophetic traditions of Islam. Specifically, we often research look to talk about Prophet Abraham and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them, both who challenged the injustice and inequality of their own communities, right? For example, a recorded hadith tells of a conversation between the Prophet and his companion. So he said in the conversation, this is Ibn Jabal, he stated that he found no explicit guidance in the Quran and the Sunnah. He would rely on his own independent reasoning, which God gave him to utilize. For progressive Muslims, these early references to social justice and rational thought affirm the belief that Islam is inherently progressive and that progressive interpretations are not innovation or sinful, but rather a return to the early interpretations of Islam. That is the end of section 1. We're going to move on to lesson 2 here. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns before we move on to the historical context in section 2? You can type it in the chat if you have anything. Just a few seconds. All right, here we go. So we're going to go to lesson 2. If I see more chats come up, I will answer them as we go. Lesson 2 of this unit is the historical context of progressive Islam. So while progressive Muslims believe that Islam itself is inherently progressive religion, we must recognize that it is not always and has not always been interpreted in progressive and accurate ways. Okay, this is the heavy part here, right? Because what we have to do, and again, if you follow me, I say this all the time and I'm going to keep saying it forever. We cannot simply wave off injustice that is done in the name of Islam and then go, well, that's not Islamic of them, they're not Muslims. Meh. And then move on. We never defined it, we never got into it. We have to acknowledge the fact that a lot of these things that happen in the world in the name of Islam, they're misinterpreting, of course, but they're using the same book that we are. We can't ignore that. We can't just be like, well, that's stupid. Like, we have to be able to actually reason, sit down, look at what happened, why did this happen, and look at how we can interpret this with that heart of social justice in the modern world. And how can we push back against these injustices through Islam, through the Quran, through the Hadith, etc. So here we go. Much of its history, the dominant form of Islam's beliefs and practices have been a traditionalist form, which began during the time of the Ashartis. So the Ashartis were during the 10th century, and that traditional interpretation of Islam prioritized literal interpretations of the Quran over rational interpretations. the difference here, because literal and rational might sound like they're both similar, but when you take a literal interpretation, you are just simply taking word for word. You are not looking any deeper than that. You're not. So you're taking it very, very literally. You're not understanding things like themes, right? Thematic readings. You're not understanding symbolism. You're not understanding being able to look at sort of like almost like a hero's journey or a character development of some of the stories that are shared with us to find the moral beneath them. Whereas a rational interpretation is going to go back to that little anecdote I give you guys, or that little fun quote. Um, it's raining cats and dogs. Exactly. Yeah. So like you can't always take everything exactly word for word. So the little quote I give you guys sometimes about like the tomato of wisdom, if you guys remember that one, the tomato of wisdom, right? Which it says that knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad, right? So you can know the definition of words and you can have words, but if you cannot apply them rationally to a situation, it doesn't matter. You know, you're going to do it inaccurately because you're not actually applying it to the needs and the context that we're talking about. You know, I teach English, rhetoric, composition, literature, all of these things. I've taught a lot of different courses, and one of the funny ones I like to use for this whole concept of the literal versus the rational is like I taught fairy tales, right? And so I say, you know, like if you take a literal reader and you hand them Little Red Riding Hood, and then they'll read the story and they'll be like, wow, this book is so true. We need to go kill all the wolves. You missed the whole point. You missed the whole point. You missed everything that was talked about there, right? Um, you can't just do a literal reading of something. You really, if you are going to incorporate it into your life, you need to have the rational thought here of how you can do that well. So as we go through here, oh, let's take that question. The concept of shirk in more depth is across the line, placing too much faith in your expectations and giving other objects or beings divine qualities. Okay. Yes, let's talk about that. I'm going to save that for the Q&A at the end, but we do need to talk about that. I was reading, who's the author of that one? I have it over there. It's Being Muslim Today. If you guys know who the author is of that one, I can go find it in a minute, but it was called Being Muslim Today. And he talked about one of the inspirations for writing some of that book was he would go into his masjid, which was big, it was beautiful and everything, but when he would get in there, he noticed that Allah, right? So the name of Allah was next to calligraphy of the Prophet Muhammad's name. They were in the same size, like they were the same font and type size here on the wall. We see this sometimes where Muslims will fall very close into the Christian Jesus thing with the Prophet Muhammad, right? Whereas the Prophet Muhammad is a messenger, and of course they're going to say, well, he's not divine, right? If we go so far as to try to humanize him and show his human qualities, people will sometimes get very uncomfortable with that. So we'll go into that in the Q&A about this concept of shirk, but it's more common than some people might think. And not to say that everybody's, you know, going to hell and everybody's awful and, you know, Allah's gonna, you know, put all those people in hell or something, but just that if we're looking at a person or a human or anything that's not God, and then using that as a reason to attack people or put other people down or feel like we're superior because we have this thing or this sheikh or whoever it is that's leading us or teaching us, that gets into that realm. So we'll get over go over to that later. So let's take a look. Yeah, so we're gonna highlight some individuals here whose interpretations were progressive and they're not modern, right? Again, a lot of people say progressive Islam, new, it's innovation. You just came up with it, right? No, 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 no. Progressive Muslims believe that Islam's been progressive since the start, and there have been progressive scholars for throughout the centuries. So we're going to take a look at some of those. So perhaps the most famous of these individuals, at least in the realm of Islamic philosophy, is Ibn Rushd. Uh, so he's a 12th century Andalusian philosopher who's known as the father of secular thought in Islam. He believed that philosophy, like Islam, was another way of reaching the truth, and that there was no contradiction between philosophy and religion. So that trying to understand these contexts, right? Trying to understand this fruit salad is another form of worship that it helps bring you closer to God to think about these things. Which is great. We have he emphasized self-reflection, individual interpretation, understanding that differences in interpretation of Islamic texts would always exist, that it's not only one of them is correct. I remember one of my favorite stories also from Hadith. They've brought it up at different masjids I've been to, is the one where the Prophet Muhammad sends the people on a trip and says, hey, like, and make sure you remember to pray when you get there. And then they're like not there yet, and the time to pray has already passed. And so the guys are like, should we just stop and pray, or should we pray when we get there? Because he said to pray when we got there, but I'm sure he didn't think it was going to take this long. So half of them prayed during the trip, and then half of them prayed later when they got there. And when they came back to him and they told him, hey, like, which one of us was right? He goes, you guys are both right. Right? There's so much about intention here over just ritualistic choices that we need to keep in consideration. That's where this rationality and this philosophy comes from. So going into the historical context of progressive Islam as far as like modernism goes, while we said it's not modernism, there are some parts of modernism that do overlap. So we're going to take a look at some of those here. So modernism in Islam began with two movements during the 19th century. That was the Tanzimat movement of the Ottoman Empire, and then the Salafiyya movement, which was from Syria. So the Tanzimat movement was focusing on harmonizing Islamic theological concepts with liberal ideas about democracy, political systems, ideas that were imported from Europe, but which the movement's leaders asserted had roots in Islamic Golden Age. So they were saying, like, yeah, Europe is doing this right now, but we did it first with the Islamic Golden Age. So really, its foundations are Islamic. And then the Salafiyya movement was similar in the socio-political stance, but they did disagree with the secular nature of their movement. They had an affinity for the so-called European thoughts and philosophy. They didn't agree with like the way that that was being blended. They had an emphasis on the generation of Muslims who lived with and immediately after the Prophet. So it's going to be like literally like the people he taught, the people that were around him, and like 1 to 2 generations after that was the most like pure form of Islam. So here's a few quick hits from each. So the Tanzimat movement was Ottoman Empire between 1839 and 1876. It sought to actually shift to a democratic state. It included a secular school system, new commercial and criminal laws, equality for non-Muslims, guarantee of rights, property, life, etc. This was implemented alongside Sultan Pan-Islam and his movement, but ultimately it came to an end after the Sultan consolidated all authority and power, corrupting the reform movement. So you guys probably know the saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. A lot of things are good ideas until someone's given a little too much power. And then it goes back to that hierarchical thinking. And now they're like, well, I'm on top and I want to stay on top. And it's awesome. I'm awesome. Can implement all of these things now because I can. And then, that causes great ideas to die and fall apart because they can't be maintained under authoritarian or military, rule. It has to be done from a place of open heart and this social justice equality, which requires you to put your ego down, right? Like it requires you to humble yourself for that to happen. And then some quick hits with the Salafia movement. So this originated in Syria. It spread with the help of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abduh, the great Mufti of Egypt, who advocated for an independent analysis of the Quran and the Sunnah, emphasized the importance of ijtihad and the rejection of taqlid, which is the adherence to established precedents, meaning like that's the way it's always been, we have to do it that way. This was like, we can take a look at things and adapt. Um, prioritize the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, particularly hadith recorded by the first three generations of Muslims. Again, really trying to focus back to those like original roots there. So we can, so that they could, just focus on like what they thought was like the purest form. It also emphasized the compatibility with rational thought, science, unity of God, all of that. But it did change by the late 19th century to represent an Islamic revival movement. It continued to prioritize a return of the faith to the early ancestors, but through military jihad rather than intellectual effort and reform. So here we go again. People decide to choose violence and everything gets ruined at the end. The whole history repeats itself. That pattern repeats itself in almost every society forever, honestly. It's unfortunate. There was within the modernist movement a general acknowledgement that Muslim societies were on the decline in comparison to European societies at the time. Modernists blamed both a lack of natural sciences and incorporation of philosophy in Islamic societies, but also Western imperialism and the violence and destruction associated with being subjects of colonial empires. Modernists' relationship with the West and with Western ideals is not an easy thing to understand because it differed between the different movements and their experience with it. So, of course, this is that like we have to look at everything in context, right? So being able to say that you notice that maybe things aren't going the way that you want it to go, also acknowledging that outside forces might also be making it worse. You have to be able to hold both of those things true, and it can get a little complicated, but that's why you really got to hold true to those core values as you go. So Itefiki Hamiyet, or the Patriotic Alliance, sought to introduce Western movements and values into Muslim societies. Others, led by those like Jamal al-Afghani, initially supported the British and their imperialism in Muslim countries before shifting its stance to oppose imperialism, claiming that Muslims must be nationalized and politically active rather than submissive to foreign domination. Others claimed that the values of the modernist movements sought to introduce them to Muslim societies like democracy, equality, progressive enlightenment, that would not exist without Islam, and that they believe that they were originally derived with the Islamic Golden Age. So again, gets a little complicated. You can agree that the people that are trying to force their culture on you, right, like the whole like Western imperialism, savior complex problem, that is bad, while also acknowledging the fact that maybe they were doing some things that like might have put some people in like a better position, but you want that for your people. And here, what they're trying to say is that there have been moments in time like the Islamic Golden Age when that wasn't the Europeans making them do that. Like that was purely from strong and diverse and socially just movements within Islamic societies themselves. You don't need to have this like Western colonial, we're better than you, group come in and tell you how to be, right? Like that Islam itself, it can be progressive and focus on knowledge and equality and all of these things without needing this like outside influence. But despite these differences, the diverse modernity movements of the 19th century shared certain core values that have influenced Islamic movements. Here's a great quote by Mustafa Akyol. Again, shout out to these wonderful pieces from him. He highlights the general consensus of the movements as, quote, an effort to reread Islam's fundamental sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, the practice of the Prophet, by placing them in their historical context and then reinterpreting them non-literally in the light of the modern context. These movements attempted to interpret Islam so that it was relevant to the changing world around Muslims, particularly in the context of democratic institutions, while also incorporating Islam and faith into various public institutions. So also important that, let's see, it's important to note that while the modernist movement sought to incorporate so-called Western values into their communities, they used a selective approach to selecting Enlightenment values so as to ensure that they can reconcile with the Islamic values, and that these Enlightenment values, on the premise that many values associated with the Enlightenment were actually inspired, again, Islamic Golden Age. So you can go back into other times in Islam specifically to find these, what we would now call Western values, right? That those were an inherent part of what is called the Islamic Golden Age, and that you can use that as inspiration as well. You don't necessarily have to like look to like, well, the West is doing something that we think is great, we should be Western, and instead be inspired by the history of Islam itself. In addition to reincorporating these modern values, it sought to transform how Muslims engaged with sacred texts of Islam. It said that only authentic Sunnah and limited the emphasis on following Hadith as part of the religious practice. In doing so, modernists prioritized the Quran above all. Okay, I talked about this in some previous videos, if you've seen them, and this is that the Quran is the word of God, right? And then the Hadith get complicated because there's so much context you have to take into this, because this often turns into a he said, she said. And it's not to say that those people weren't being honest, right? They could have super accurately represented it. But if it was passed down as an oral tradition and then wasn't written down until later, if you miss a word or you switch a word or anything like that, that can change the whole meaning of what was going on. Understanding that many of these things were based on situations that the Prophet himself was in at the time. Those contexts might not be relevant to what's going on today. Some of the things he said or did could have been personal feelings, personal thoughts or expressions or ways of doing things. So we always have to bring them back to the Quran, and that's what it says here, right? That we always have to come back to the Quran as the basis, and then make sure that we're vetting and very adamant about making sure that we only use the hadith that are proven, right, that are authentic, and then also that they apply to the context of the time and that they don't go against anything from the Quran as well. Additionally, the modernists utilized reason on the basis for interpreting the Quran, authentic hadith, refuting the traditionalist literal translation. Again, literalism, like literal readings, not the way to go. Because, yeah, we went over that with the Red Riding Hood thing. You might miss the point. You might miss the symbolism and the depth and the just overall multi-layered pieces to whatever is being read or shared or said, if you just take like literal word for word from all of the texts. Modernists use the principles of Maqasid al-Sharia, which we went over in the last class, to also understand how to confront these. So core aspects of the modernist movement, here's some quick hits. Adaptation of Islamic law according to current political and social situations. We have that in common. Deployment of ijtihad to determine legal decisions. We're going to go over a little bit in a minute. We're almost done with the lesson, but what the definition of what ijtihad is. Independent thought, invoking the Maqasid al-Sharia, right? Which again is that like, what are the goals of the Sharia? How can you tell if you're doing it right? That we went over in the last class. Restricted Islamic law to be based on the Quran and Sunnah. Reinterpret the Quran and Hadith to transform Ijma, or the consensus of Muslim community, and juristic reasoning, and then use these new interpretations to reconsider the accessibility of specific aspects of the Islamic texts that conflicted with the values drawn from the Quran. So understanding things like polygamy, violent interpretations of jihad, penal punishments, women's rights, and interfaith relations, right? Saying, okay, we know more now. We understand about psychology. We have moved on as a group, as humans. For example, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, couldn't pull up the cell phone and text somebody on the other side of the world, right? So having contact with people that are completely different than you all the time, right? There's a lot going on in the modern world that wasn't necessarily there before. Got to keep that in mind. Let's see the last section here. So despite the strength and breadth of the modernist movement across the Muslim world, it fell apart and declined with the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So the progressive Islam movement itself has roots in the modernist movement with its emphasis on rational thinking. However, the progressive Islam movement is not itself a continuation of the modernist movement, as many scholars of the progressive movement criticize the modernists for their alleged deification of the Eurocentric values and their attempt to duplicate Western systems in the Muslim communities. So with the modernists, they might say that, well, the West was doing really well at this stuff, so then we need to just do what the West is doing somehow while also being Islamic in our life. But here, with the progressive interpretation, we're here to say that, yes, we know more. We need to have all this rational reasoning, but we don't need to necessarily draw from things that are outside of Islam. Islam itself already has it all there. We just need to, use our rationale, use our research, use our experiences, and understand that that is the basis for all of our progressive social justice goals. Again, going back to multiple critique, it's important to criticize both Western-centric movements and Islamic fundamentalism, both sides of this, right? The critique of the modernist movement is that they relied far too much on scholarship and theory rather than the application of scholarship to improve the well-being of the Muslim societies. Most importantly, perhaps, the use of the Maqasid al-Sharia and the emphasis on the importance of ijtihad is something that we share. So really quick, I want to give you guys this definition of ijtihad, what it was, what it is, and we will be done and we'll be able to do our Q&A. Okay? So ijtihad, the term itself comes from the root, the JHD, right? So like in Arabic, a root is 3 consonants, and then those consonants are shared in words of the same root. So jahada or jahdua. So this is going to be early Islamic history. Ijtihad referred to the process of the early Muslim jurists who used to reach legal rulings and address various social issues. So ijtihad was originally saying, you are a learned person. They originally had requirements of fluency in Arabic language and its grammar, extensive knowledge of the Quran and Hadith, and expertise in legal theory, also known as fiqh, right? So saying, hey, you're a learned person. In each situation, use your knowledge and your judgment to come up with the best ruling. And again, this was to say that like it wasn't you are under some authoritarian figure or somebody up here that's now going to make sure that all of these judges and all of these people are doing exactly what they're supposed to say. Ijtihad was the idea that if you have knowledge of this area, you don't need to ask somebody else to figure this out for you. Like you can figure it out. You have rationale, you have a brain, you have experience and understand the context. You have the right to interpret, right? This has sort of changed over time. And in more modern times, it's used not just for those scholars that have like a little certificate that says like, you're a really smart Muslim and now you can use ijtihad, right? But also just for people who are learned, and for each of us individually to learn and understand Allah and read the Quran and take our own knowledge and our own lessons and contexts and interpretations in our own life, right? We don't need to ask somebody else. Again, I was raised in the Catholic Church. This isn't the Catholic Church. You don't have to go through a priest to be forgiven or to talk to God, right? Like it's you. That is between you and God. I got an email from one of the viewers that just met. It was just so beautiful. She was saying that she thought that she would have to leave Islam. She felt like she would have to because she had suffered all of these abuses of people in the name of Islam, and she believed everything that they taught her about what Islam is. And she said that after looking at some of the like MPV's lessons and all of those, that she was able to believe in herself that she had the right to read the Quran and learn it for herself instead of going through these other people. So she went back, she read the Quran again, and she said that it just like changed her heart. Like she fell in love with Islam again. She's been praying and it just meant so much to her. And I thought that was so great because that can get exhausting. I'm sure many of you can experience or understand this experience or have experienced it, know somebody who has, where you hear so many toxic or negative or just cruel things, right? And people will say, well, that's what Islam says. Funny thing, as we said in the last class, Islam can't speak for itself, right?
Yeah.
It has to be interpreted by humans. But when you have so many people telling you that stuff, you're like, dang, like, is that really? No, there's no way. Like, I've read the books, I've read the Quran, I've done all this, I've done these classes. Like, there's no way that that's what that says. It takes faith in Allah and faith in yourself to not just doubt that you have the ability to reason. That's one of the things that Allah gave us, right? Is the ability to learn, to reason, to grow, to understand. And that you need to go do that for yourself. And that's okay. Like you can do that. You can absolutely do that. There's no one there to stop you. You got this. Go read, learn, grow, connect with Allah as you can, and then go out in the world and try to be a good person. That's really all there is to that. In the next class next month, we're going to go over the second half of this unit. We're going to really get into ijtihad and some of the principles within progressive Islam, how that works.